the guys asked me to, talk about Agrippa and about the process of translating Agrippa. And it's so difficult to know where to begin with that, because it's such, you spend a couple of years living with somebody day in, day out, and you start to, think you're gaining insight, but then you realize that maybe you're not, and I think really it's going to be the conversation later. When you have questions, I think this is where the conversation will really begin. It will crystallize. So I'm going to ramble autistically for a while. But I think, if I had to choose one thing to say is that Agrippa is an exceedingly interesting and exceedingly important person. He's somebody whose ideas, I think, have not been completely explored yet. And there's just a couple of things I want to touch on before we talk together. But and the first one is about Agrippa and the Copernican revolution, first of all, and how this relates to his critique of, or his apparent critique of the three books of occult philosophy. There's a tendency to, as you know, in 1533, he publishes, the second edition, and at the end, he appends the selection of chapters from the Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, which appear to subvert his message on the surface. It appears that he's kind of saying, well, yeah, magic, but it's all rubbish, isn't it, at the end of the day? That's not really what's happening then. Because what he's doing is, he's kind of saying, well, the astrological basis of magic in his day, and of so much science and medicine in his day, is flawed. It's fundamentally flawed because it depends upon astronomical knowledge, which is partial and inconsistent and obviously deficient. And he has this chapter in the Vanity in which he talks about, it's like a Stuart Lee rant. He kind of goes through instance after instance after instance of how can I say, of various ancient and contemporary astronomical authorities being a little bit inconsistent, and obviously not quite understanding the thing in its entirety. And cutting to the chase of that, I think it makes a lot of sense when you think of Agrippa as this, early 16th century humanist, Catholic humanist, who's very much in a reformist kind of wing of things, who's moving in those circles that are discussing Copernicus before Copernicus was published. Now, Copernicus is published about a decade later, and actually after. I mean, Agrippa didn't live to see it published, but certainly the ideas were circulating. People knew, and in essence, I think my opinion, humbly, is that what he's doing here is saying, look, the Copernican paradigm shift is going to force us to reinterpret everything. Everything which is dependent upon astrology is going to have to be reinterpreted, because we think we understand the relationship between the celestial and the sublunar, between the planets and the stars and ourselves and everything that walks and crawls and eats and poos, but we don't. Because the moment we place the sun in the middle of the solar system, things clarify, things make sense, but also we have to reinterpret. And in some respects, I'm working on Giordano Bruno as well at the moment, of course, and Bruno goes further in this and talking about how, we can anticipate the existence of other stars and other planets and the complications that also arise from that, which I think Agrippa would be very comfortable with, personally. But when you think about it, if that's the case, and it is a gift, I feel a lot more work has to be done, and I'm not, I myself I want to look deeper into that, but if that's the case, then that locates Agrippa on the leading edge of the greatest scientific paradigm shift in history. He's somebody who is, if you like, teasing Copernicus' findings, and that's extraordinary. That means you have to look at him in an entirely new way. But also more than that, what he's doing is saying, look, I've written this enormous book on occultism, most of which is based on astrology. However, there's something coming down the road here which is going to force me and you and everybody to reconsider this. And he assimilates it, and he considers the implications. And that is a highly intelligent thing to do. That's something which truly is atypical. I think most people would be resistant to change or would, you know, ride its coattails. But he's actively thinking about it. And so that's the first thing, is that there's a real possibility, and I believe myself that it's the case. But you know, like I said, in all candor, you know, a lot more research needs to be done into this. But I believe that, you know, what is driving at here is that, you know, the world is about to change, and that we as magicians, as natural philosophers, as this, that, and the other, we need to change with it. And that's very modern. That feels very contemporary, you know. The second thing, which is also big, is, I mean, the end of the fourth book, I put, there's a chapter from the Vanity of Sciences, the Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, which is about sex workers, basically. De meretricia. It's. I mean, I didn't translate the Latin because I wanted it to have a certain gravitas, because I believe it's an important thing. But it's about harlotry. It's about whoredom, whatever you want to call it, and it's following on from his critique. I mean, he one thing you notice about him is very typically German reformist. He doesn't like monks, and he doesn't like nuns, and he doesn't like friars. And so he has this chapter where, you know, he's talking about them, and immediately afterwards he sort of says, well, you know, of course, you know, wherever you find a house of Minorites, you're going to find a bawdy house. You know, oh. And that's all very, you know, yeah, we've read Boccaccio, we've read Chaucer, we know that, all right, nothing special. But what he goes on to say is that the thing is that first of all, if we look at the ancient authorities, sex work is considered to be a public good. It's considered to be something which is not a shameful activity at all. Actually, it's something which rather is conducive to the well-being of society as a whole. Not only that, but also in the same ancient authorities, there are women who are engaged in sex work who are also the priestesses of important temples, who are also oracles, who are being consulted by the social elites of their day. They're being taken seriously, you know, and shown reverence. And also, some of these women, some of the time, are, through their oracular speech or through their interventions, are actually the saviors of their nations. Now, that doesn't, I mean, for us, in, you know, the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, it's kind of okay, you know, but this is the early 16th century. You know, this is the 1620s, this is the 1520s, and people generally didn't say that stuff. You know, it's something which, you know, you're talking about stuff here which reminds me, when I was translating it, I was working through it and double taking to a certain degree and thinking, you know, surely not. I mean, it reminded me of Robert Graves and the White Goddess. You know, there's a sense, there's an interest here, because what he's talking about here is not just the equality of the sexes. He's talking about the primacy of the feminine. And this becomes apparent in some of his other writings as well. There's a treatise that he wrote prior to that. It was a few years before, in which he talks about the, you know, the story of the fall from Eden. And the way he talks about it is very much of you know, not so much as, you know, traditionally, of course, Eve is represented as a victim and as villain in many ways. She's blamed, you know. His account, he says, well, actually, no, Eve, you know, didn't fall herself, because she actually tasted of the fruit of knowledge. She wasn't banned from it. She wasn't forbidden at all. The issue is that she was tricked into tricking Adam, who was forbidden from tasting of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And so you have Eve and this telling of the story as an initiator, you know, and as somebody, moreover, who has been granted the gift of, you know, Gnostic knowledge, if you like, before Adam. There's almost a sense in which that the general scheme of things here seems to be that Eve will possess this knowledge, but Adam will not. And Agrippa, when he allegorizes this, he talks about Eve as being represented, as being an embodiment of reason, while Adam is the embodiment of faith. And that's not what you expect. You kind of expect the opposite generally, you know. And that's radical. That's really radical. And it's not what you expect. It's not typical of Hermeticists of that period. It is typical of figures like the Antinomians and the Anabaptists. It's definitely typical of the things we see in mid-17th century England, when we get to the Seekers and the Ranters and the Quakers. And that opens a certain door as well, because of course the English translation of Agrippa is in the 1650s, is at the height of this ferment in England. And so that's the thing. I mean, in the second, he says at the end of the book, he says, I have a message, there's a message in here that the wise will perceive and, dullards will miss. And that's typical, everybody says it. But in the case of Agrippa, there is a message. And that message, oddly enough, is almost as if the occultism, the Hermeticism is on the surface. Beneath that, you have this much deeper message about, which comes to the surface at the end of the third book, when he's talking about personal illumination. I mean, the culmination of this whole thing is not the talisman, it's not the, the things about magical fish and things like this. It's about the personal encounter with the supernatural and how that transforms you. And that is very much the kind of radical edge of the Reformation. And so there are three things here. Agrippa as potentially something of a leading edge in terms of the revelation of the Copernican revolution. You have Agrippa as somebody who's, I mean, if you want to say he's a proto-feminist, I suppose you could, but I don't think that does it justice. I think it's a clumsy way of talking about it. But then you also have him as somebody who might very well be involved in some of the most interesting and radical aspects of the Reformation as well. And that he's potentially using his Hermeticism to some extent as a kind of vehicle for that. That oddly enough, his Kabbalism and his interest in Neoplatonism is something which is much more respectable. He doesn't get, it's not so criticized as it is, to say that, well, actually, we don't need a priesthood to talk to God, or in fact, women are not an inferior vessel. So yeah, so perhaps disappointingly now, I mean, I would have to say I'm reluctant to synthesize this because I'm still in process. I'm now convinced that I think I'm going to translate a full translation of the Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, because I think that book needs to be out there. I also want to translate his book, his treatise on the Garden of Eden, because I think that genuinely is illuminating. His Excellency of Women and his essay on matrimony likewise, reveals something about a fine and unusual mind who's thinking things and saying things that, very few people were thinking and saying at the time. Let's put it that way. What does it have to do with magic? Well, from the point of view of 16th century magic, you would say, well, not much. But when we look at magic today, I would say there's a definite resonance. There's a sense in which, when you have an author in the 16th century who seems to be talking about this radical equality of the sexes, for example, which is also transformative. There's a sense of the feminine as initiating. I mean, I don't have to tell you. I mean, you know what that's pointing at. Likewise, he has a chapter in the third book where he talks about, how to get in touch with the spirits of nature, And I think it's one of the most lovely chapters of the book. I adore it. I love translating it because it's so tonally different to so much else in the book. It comes across as being so heartfelt, And it reminded me of, when I was in my own teens, one of the first books I read on these subjects was Marianne Green's Natural Magic, which I really got into. And it really spoke to me. And I think it reminded me of that kind of approach, this very gentle, non-doctrinal kind of approach to a very organic kind of paganism, And that's what he's saying. He's just saying, look, if you want spirits of meadow and of the woodland and a babbling brook, if you want to talk to nymphs and satyrs, what you need to do is just go to these places, offer them sweet incense, bring along a fine wine, play sweet music, but most importantly, be the kind of person they want to talk to, right? Consider who would they actually want to connect to. And to be honest with you, I think that advice to this day is relevant. I very much doubt there's anybody watching this who would disagree substantially. And he's saying this in the 16th century, and frankly, you could repackage it and publish it with a Llewellyn press and make a fortune. It would still run today. And that's the thing. I think the odd thing is, I think Agrippa's time in terms of occultism, oddly enough, is coming now. And yes, he has this afterlife, the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries as a kind of folkloric wizard, He's kind of assimilated with Johannes Faustus, but that in a way is kind of fictional. It's not who he was. And I mean, even in the context of, the three books of occult philosophy, I don't think that's what it's really about. But in a real sense, I think some of his preoccupations and some of his essential preoccupations resonate today in a way that they didn't resonate in his own day. I think, and likewise, I think in terms of, the 18th and 19th and even the 20th century, there's been a tendency to overlook the things which were probably closest to his heart, actually. But now, I think there's an audience, I think, who's more appreciative, of where it's coming from. So, yes, there we are. If you look at the timeline of his life, it's bewildering, because he went to so many places and he did so many things in so many different contexts, and it really depends what you're talking about. And I think that he, it's sometimes said that that the mark of an artist, or a real artist or real writer, is that they write or they paint or they make music because they have to. It's an end to itself. And I think for Agrippa, that's what it was. I think he was somebody who particularly enjoyed controversy. He didn't back down from fights at all, and that was a problem. Like Giordano Bruno, in fact, he's very antagonistic, and I think you get the impression sometimes he just enjoys, getting into arguments for the sake of the argument. But in all honesty, I genuinely think he had a very inquiring mind, and he genuinely loved to look into these things and to explore them and to share it. I don't think he had a great agenda as such, which is probably a disappointing answer, but there we go. Because the third book, which, when he starts talking about, this idea of that the culmination of ceremonial magic is actually this personal encounter with the supernatural, to put it that way. And that encounter is unmediated. It's something which is actually, it's not something, you have to pass through any kind of, there's no, filter as such. But also that it's transformative, that you become a better person for it. And so it's a situation where in order to encounter that, to have that experience, first of all, you have to go through a process of purification. And he describes that, that, you have to meet the supernatural halfway, But when you do, then the result is something which is completely transforming. And I think in terms of modern terminology, we would refer to that as Gnostic. But we've got to be very careful. In terms of historical terminology, no, I don't think it is. I think it's something else. And to be honest with you, my own opinion, for what it's worth, I think it's pointing more towards what was happening with, the Anabaptists and the Antinomians and the kind of fringe of the Reformation, where you have these ideas of, of a radical kind of, a radical relationship with the divine, which is unmediated, which is not bound by conventional morality or by conventional theology or ecclesiology. That idea of of being free to explore the divine on your own terms, which I guess ultimately, William Blake becomes a culmination of that in some respects. If you think about William Blake's kind of outlook, Agrippa has those qualities. And I wish I could say more, but I can't. That's where my own research, if you like, is at the moment, is looking into that and trying to develop it. But yeah, so in a sense, I think in the modern way we use the word Gnostic, I think that's what it's talking about. There is that definite sense that the whole point of this is about having this transformative experience of the supernatural. But in a historical sense, of course, that's not really what's happening now. So I hope that answers the question. Off the cuff, the obvious answer is, oh yes, of course, he was a Renaissance Hermeticist. The thing is that, I was thinking about this in a run-up, is it about whether you consider him, what does it mean to be a Hermeticist in the 16th century? And the problem is that we're viewing it through the lens of the 19th, and in the 16th century, the 15th, 16th, 17th century, it was a lot looser. I mean, in many respects, to say that somebody's a Hermeticist is just to say that they're a little bit like Marsilio Ficino, And insofar as that's true, yeah, he is. He's a friend of TRITHEMIUS, and he's influenced by, Giorgio and, Ficino and Pico and so forth. So, he belongs to that kind of set. But and certainly he's drawing upon the Neoplatonists and he's articulating them. And I think he, by and large, I believe that he accepted that model. But to say he's a Neoplatonist, I don't know. It doesn't sit right with me. I think that his reason for it is precisely that the culmination of the thing is his emphasis upon, almost as if saying he erects this kind of scaffolding of this conceptual kind of scaffolding, which he then throws away. And he says, well, look, none of that's really important. The important thing is actually encountering God on your own terms. And for myself, I'm comfortable with the kind of the dissonance. And I think it's a product of just being a work in progress and genuinely about intellectually where he was, And so is he a Neoplatonist? He's interested in Neoplatonism. He articulates it. Is he? I don't know. Is the honest answer? I honestly can't say. My feeling is that I don't feel he is, but that's kind of counterintuitive. And that's probably a very useless answer as well. But that's what you paid for. I wish I knew more about it. I so wish I knew more, and it's great at the moment because those books are being written. There are very fine minds in our community who are looking into the role of how the conception of the feminine divine and the idea of feminine initiation develops. I don't know if they were aware of it even. Because, of course, their focus tended to be on the 3 books of occult philosophy, and it doesn't feature there. He doesn't, he doesn't really talk about it. This is stuff that exists in some of his lesser writings in his opus, and in, of course, the Vanities of the Sciences. So I really don't know, to be honest with you. It's quite possible they didn't know. They didn't make the connection with it. But thinking about it, it's, in the case of the GD, I mean, they certainly borrowed an awful lot in other places from Agrippa. I mean, Agrippa becomes, I guess, greatly thanks to Francis Barrett, he becomes this encyclopedic source. And I guess also because of his folkloric kind of afterlife, there's a kind of nimbus of kind of edginess around him, and I suspect that, we use the word occult because of the 3 books of occult philosophy. I think if he'd called it something else, we would be calling it something else. But on those deeper questions, to be honest with you, in all humility, I don't know. I really don't know. And I look forward in coming years to finding out, because I believe that those books will be written. And we're going to be seeing things very differently. So, yeah. It took me around about 2 years, I think. A little less than 2 years, kind of, progressively. The most difficult thing actually was the apocryphal 4th book, just because it's awful in some respects. It's not Agrippa. I mean, if you've read Agrippa in Latin, then it's obviously not written by Agrippa, but it is genuinely, I found it a real challenge because it was quite badly expressed at times. It's one of those things. It's an interesting thing. The most difficult things to translate are things that are a bit wonky. Fine poetry is not a problem, but when you have somebody who's almost speaking the language like a second language, then it can be actually quite challenging. So oddly enough, it was the 4th book, the Heptameron that follows it wasn't a problem, but I really struggled with that. And by the way, if you look at the English translation, the sort of the Renaissance English translation of those books, they struggled with it as well. You can see that they have the same kind of problems, and so it was sometimes quite funny comparing notes and realizing, but yeah, that's the answer. Years back, I mean, at university, I read the Fluellen, the great Fluellen kind of annotated 1650s, just a putative John French translation, and it kind of, and I feel like a lot of people it washed over because it's a very difficult text. Even if you're comfortable, I think with early modern English, it's a difficult text. sometimes. And so I kind of went into it without too many expectations, actually. But the thing that surprised me was were the flashes of humor. You know, he's has quite a wry sense of humor, and you know, there are times when genuinely you get that sense that he doesn't wear himself, he doesn't carry himself, he carries himself lightly, more lightly than you would expect. I think he's more of a, you know, I think to some extent, again, we're looking at things through the lens of 19th century preoccupations with everything sounding like the King James Bible, or the way that, you know, A. Waite would translate things. And, you know, the actual 16th century Latin is a lot more informal, and it's a lot more, it's more direct, and it has a sense of personality about it. And I would say that's the thing that really caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that, you know, but yeah. I mean, because as I understand it, Don Tyson's, because I haven't read it myself at university, and as I recall it, his is an edit of the 1650s edition, you know, and which renders it a lot more accessible, and his annotation helps, you know, to orient it. And so that's a different kind of project, you know, it's not translation, as I understand it. I believe that's correct. In the case of Eric, I don't know, because it hasn't been published, so I don't know. I haven't read it, so I have no idea. What I would say about this elephant in the room, is that I believe that in our community and in our publishing community, that, you know, a spring tide raises all boats. You know, that we should be, you know, cooperation is better than competition, and that the truth is that if you have two people, you know, it's not like Highlander. It's not the case that there can only be one. You know, you can have two translations of Agrippa, which will be doing different work. They will have different readerships. They will have a different. So, for example, I gather that Eric's translation, he's very interested in looking at the textual sources of Agrippa in a way that I think Don Tyson was. That's great. Very different from what I'm doing. I'm presenting it as literature. You know, I'm approaching it in a different way. That's cool. You know what? That's fine. Whatever I do promotes him. Whatever he does promotes me, and we all get good. You know, and so. That's all I can say about it. You know what? Good luck to him. I hope he finds his readership. But like I said, his translation, from what I gather, is doing a different thing. And I think we have to wait until it's published to find out. But, you know, which will be November, I believe. But that's cool. You know, just this is a translation. It's an Platonic Borgesian kind of quality of this. I mean, if I went back and translated Agrippa again, it would be different now. The emphasis will be different. The tone sometimes will be different. You're always creating a new text. There's no definitive version, you know, and I think it's actually good that there are different translations out there, because it suits different readerships with different preoccupations and different folky, you know. So yeah, that's where I stand. So Eric, if you're watching this, there you go. It depends what you're talking about there. I mean, I think in the first draft of Agrippa, of the 3 books of occult philosophy, one of the things I had to do when I was translating, I had to make a decision that there were some passages, some chapters where I had to trim it a little bit because it becomes very circular. He over-explains, you know, and he repeats himself. And it's not very helpful. There's a point where he's not providing any additional information, and so I kind of edited it, I kind of smoothed it out. And I think it's because it is very much, you know, you have this younger Agrippa who's kind of pulling this material together from different sources and synthesizing it as he goes along. And, you know, he doesn't have an editor on his shoulder saying, you know, you want to kind of clean that up. When he comes back later on, of course, it becomes much more elegant. I mean, there are passages, like I said, that chapter on, you know, communion with nature, I think it's wonderful. You know, it's a beautiful chapter and has such a different tone. But it's very, I mean, I think the key to it in a way, I mean, you especially see it in the Vanity of the Sciences, where the satire is often quite, you know, sometimes very subtle and sometimes not. Like I said, that juxtaposition of the chapter on monasteries and on brothels is not subtle. You know, that's kind of typical of the period. But you have this kind of, for example, the chapter where he's talking about his critique of astronomy, where he kind of goes down this list of all the notable figures, you know, and indicating examples of controversy and examples of inconsistency. And he gets to Ptolemy and he block capitals it, you know, he presses it. And he's saying, even Ptolemy, you know, for F's sake, for flip's sake, even Ptolemy, is inconsistent and incoherent. And there's a kind of there is a sort of the use of what were established comedic tropes. That he's self-consciously being satirical, but he's like all good satire, all real satire is driving a serious point, and he is throughout that. But that's the thing. I think genuinely he's a very enjoyable read. And that's the thing about the 17th century translation, unfortunately, often isn't a very enjoyable read because it's such a literal translation, and very literal translations often become very, very kind of dull and flat. And the original Latin is quite buoyant, and there's a sense of personality shining through. There's a sense of a generosity of outlook. There's always a warmth about him. You can see, for example, when he got into trouble for his philosemitism, at one point, and you can see that. You really can see it in the way he talks about Jewish people. His kind of proto-feminism, likewise, you can see it. That's heartfelt, and it's really kind of coming through. So yeah, there are lots and lots of little instances of it, but I'd have to go back through it myself and have a look and pick things up because there's so many, But yeah, but as I say at the end of the end of my introduction to the fourth book is that in the end, I like him. I like him a lot actually, and I hope you do too. And if you come out of reading it actually like being fond of him, then I think it's done its job, But yeah, he's a laugh, is what I'm saying. He was a right laugh. It's true. He was married 3 times, I believe. But yeah, that's true. It comes across very strongly that he's, like I said, I mean, when the chapter on sex work is what it is, but it's what he's driving at is, on the surface of it, it's all very carry on and kind of, well, hey, but he's also driving at something quite radical and quite important, and that's good satire. It's like, what we find with Jonathan Swift. Yeah, it's funny, it's confrontational, but also it's saying something of real depth and real import, and yeah, and I think there is this passion, he like Giordano Bruno, he wasn't somebody who stepped down from an argument, he spends his life traveling around Central Europe getting into fights, and largely not winning them, it has to be said, but but yeah, there is that sense of him, there's a sparkling personality, and I think he represents a certain type of humanism, reforming humanism of that period, which was flattened by Calvinism and by the Counter-Reformation. There's something very cavalier about him. But I don't know. I think each reader needs to judge for themselves. I think you need to look at it. There is a laconic humor. Let's put it that way. But by the same token, if you wanted to take him at face value, if you wanted to give a much more formal and kind of lend him gravitas, you could. And I would say the 1650s translation does that. It presents it in a more kind of serious tone, but I don't think it works. I think when you actually read it, like I said, I was very much going into it thinking that's what it would be, and I discovered actually it's not. It's a lot more lively, and it's a lot cleverer. But again, this is the point: is that there's more than one conceivable way to translate this. And I personally prefer to find those little flashes and kind of foreground them. I think another person, quite validly, could do the opposite and actually say it's not significant. It's not relevant. So there we go. Mine is the funny, sexy Agrippa. That's what I'm offering. That's from me to you. From what I know about that, the fact that the 3 books of occult philosophy happened, I think that book crystallized because he met, I think it's about 1510, wasn't it, around about. And so as Agrippa in maybe his mid to late 20s, he meets TRITHEMIUS. And he spends a few days with him. He visits TRITHEMIUS in his Rhineland monastery, and they talk, they spend this time together. And he just comes out of it transformed. And I don't think anybody knows what happened. It's just that TRITHEMIUS's personality catalyzes him. And he finishes the 3 books of occult philosophy, the first edition anyway. And so I think the fact that that book was finished the way it was is because of that encounter with TRITHEMIUS. But I don't think it's an encounter with his writings, it's the encounter with the personality. And I love that it's something which, it's so personal that it's not for us to know. It's not our business really to know what happened, what transpired. But it's not the first time. I mean, we get that sense when, around about the same time, he visits London, and he meets John Colet, and he probably meets Thomas More, and possibly Erasmus as well, because Erasmus was in London at the time. And again, I mean, the result of that is he comes back and he writes a very kind of Colet-like kind of book on the Epistles of St. Paul, which I believe is lost. There's no extant copy. And yeah, you get a sense of him. It's almost the kind of thing that Gurdjieff talked about, this idea of meetings with extraordinary people. He's traveling in Central Asia, meeting this person, that person. The difference is that Agrippa actually did it. I think Agrippa actually was traveling Europe, meeting these extraordinary personalities, and they were catalyzing him. And his life is punctuated by these meetings, and TRITHEMIUS was one of them. And so personally, I think that the influence was very, very personal. Let's put it that way. But I don't know how, if that's necessarily the answer you're looking for, but I hope it is. I do hope it is. In his 20s, when he was in Paris as a student, there's a bit of kind of shakiness about exactly what he was doing in Paris, but he belonged to a circle. He formed a circle of fellow kind of occult scholars, fellow Hermeticists. And there are points in the book where he does reference, experimentation he was involved in. He talks about certain things, in the first person, And so you have these hints, and I'm told that the correspondence exists. He names, different members of this group, this sodality, as he calls it. And so he belongs to an active occult subculture. And so he's doing these things. Genuinely, he's part of the spirit of the age, where on the one hand, he's reading Porphyry, and he's reading, and he's reading contemporaries like Reuchlin and so forth, and synthesizing that. But at the same time, he's also experimenting. He's looking into things practically. And that also includes the kind of things we're talking about on the edges of the Reformation, the idea of, this very radical idea of, contact with, personal illumination. That I suspect is part of it as well later on. But this is the thing, is this process, the process of kind of revision, there's a crisis in his life in the 1520s in France, where he gets in quite a lot of trouble, and his passport is rescinded, and it looks very, very, very sketchy for a while. And it's out of that period that he writes The Vanity of the Arts and Sciences, and sometimes it comes across, some people, I've read some scholars say it's a kind of tantrum he's throwing against the mainstream, or it isn't really. I think there's something else going on there, but sometimes it's also spoken of as being a kind of a rejection of magic per se, and it isn't. It really isn't. What he's saying is that, look, there's a basis of scientific knowledge which we have to revise, and we have to reinterpret things in the light of that. But he's not disputing that there's that celestial influence exists. He's certainly not disputing the possibility of of the existence of spirits, the existence of angels and demons, the existence he has very good chapters, for example, on the concept of the personal angel, for example. The guardian angel, which is very fine. I think, again, if you're, for our friends in Thelema, that might be an interesting read, because it's genuinely, saying things which have a resonance today. So yeah, it's kind of the revision itself. He dies, mid 1530s, as I recall. I do wonder what would happen if he'd lived another couple of decades. Had he lived into the 1570s, what the two books of occult philosophy would look like. And I suspect, in many ways, in terms of composition, it reminds me a lot of the Anatomy of Melancholy, which went through this process of continual amendment and continual kind of supplementation. And I think that's what would have happened. Because between the first edition and the second edition, it expands to about twice its size. And I think had he lived longer, it would have continued growing and assimilating ideas as they kind of came along. sure. I mean, first of all, regarding the division between natural philosophy, as they say, and magical philosophy, really at this stage there isn't one. A lot of what he would talk about as being the kind of occult properties of, of animals and plants and stones, really so much of it now would be, is modern pharmacology. And I guess Paracelsus, of course, is the great example of that. The father of modern pharmacology is himself, of course, also a preeminent occultist. The relationship, is fair to say, between science, or what we term science now, and magic, is problematic. And I think, far better educated and finer minds than my own have and are writing books discussing it. It's one of those things, those debates that goes on and on and on. Where do we draw the line? But I think for contemporaries, it was very fluid, and it really depends upon time and place and who you talk to. But by and large, I think for Agrippa, he doesn't see a distinction at all. Regarding virtue, because the word virtus in Latin really means power, and this is what when he talks about, Renaissance writers talk about the virtue of herbs, or the virtue of gemstones. They're talking about its power. They're talking about something within it, or through it. We in the sublunar world are influenced by the virtus of the planets, the virtue of the planets, and so virtue in that sense is not the modern sense of virtue. And when I was translating this, I was very aware of that, saying, well, maybe there's the scope there for misunderstanding, but I kind of feel, no, that's, the word itself is so specific, and a good way of translating it actually is energy. And if you think of when he talks about the virtue, for example, of herbs, he's talking about the energy which they kind of emit, You then have the idea of modern virtue there, the sense of moral worth and moral status. That does come into it later on, especially in ceremonial magic, because he's talking about the process of purification that's necessary if we're going to approach, the higher spirits, the higher intelligences, And so, and I think you're right. It's an aspect which is very much, it makes sense within the context of a 16th century Catholic who's writing about this. And even though, like I said, Asterix, there are things about him which are most certainly not Catholic, but this idea, I think it's pretty much universal. I remember I was translating certain passages and thinking, well, things I've read in Turkish in a Sufi kind of context were exactly the same. This idea of it being necessary to adopt a certain way of life and a certain outlook of life, and for there to be a correspondence between what you think and what you say and what you do. Good words, good deeds, and good thoughts, and that's basically it. So, and I would say, generally speaking, he says one could say it's absent in modern occultism. I don't think it is, actually. I think most people would agree, according to their own lights, that one's outlook is important. That, if you want, for example, to have a constructive relationship with spirits, I'm basically a non-denominational spiritist, if I'm anything. You have to, it's like relating to people. The way you conduct yourself is important, and that's effectively it. That's all it is. But like I said, this idea of virtue, there's virtue in a virtuous sense of the word, which is about energy and about power and the ability to effect change. And then you have this idea of the purification of the soul, in anticipation of talking to intelligences which demand that kind of purity, so it's a slightly different thing. For Black Letter Press, we're doing the Latin magical writings of Giordano Bruno, and which includes, his writings on the art of memory, and his writings on, mathematical magic and so forth. And so this is what I'm doing now. I'm up to my eyeballs in Giordano Bruno. Ask me in a year's time, because again, Bruno, first of all, is a delight to work with. He's so lucid. He writes so elegantly, and again, he has this kind of ironic sense of humor as well, which is there, but it's not. He's somebody who his turn of phrase is so beautiful. Sometimes it's very poetic. I have some ideas about who he was, and I have some ideas about why things happened the way they did. And you know, it's one of those things. As an autistic person, I look at Bruno, and I kind of recognize things. He has very autistic kind of traits sometimes, and I find that quite attractive. You know, but no, it's interesting, and it's one of those things at the moment where I'm too close to it to really say very much more about it. But the other project I'm involved in is with the Holy Fawn Press from Glastonbury, who have just established themselves, and it's a new edition of Joseph Glanville's Sadducees. I can't pronounce it. You see, I get involved in projects and I can't pronounce the titles. The Sadducees Triumphatus, which is a very important 17th century text in terms of, you know, the formulation of, you know, this relationship between science and magic, and in particular, you know, regarding skeptical attitudes towards, you know, the idea of the existence of witchcraft and spirits. It forms something of the kind of conceptual basis for what happened in Salem in particular, but also it was a major source for Margaret Murray in particular. So certain kind of aspects of modern Wicca can be traced back to it. And so there's a lot going on there. It's a very, very interesting text, but that's not a translation, but a transcription and an editing project. And so the other two things I'm working on now is Giordano Bruno, which is the really big thing. And then as a kind of hobby, I have a Glanville hobby. I have this 17th century hobby, which is working on that as well, which is all very exciting. That statue, that's the thing, you see the statue everywhere. And I hate the statue. I'm going to say this, that's not, I don't, it's a beautiful statue in itself, but it's not really an image of Giordano Bruno. And it's an image of the preoccupations of, you know, of people in the mid-19th century in relation to the Vatican. It's using Bruno as a means to an end and not an end unto itself. And so it's kind of, I'm interested in trying to get back to who he actually was. And that's how I feel about Agrippa as well. I want to try and discover who the person was, you know. And, you know, to some extent, we're all unknowable, aren't we? We're all unknowable, but we get these kind of glimpses and hints. But I think the kind of image, that kind of iconic image of, the kind of the grumpy Dominican, you know, I think it's a bit of an obstacle. I think we need to pass beyond that and try and see him as something else. Yeah. The press, we have promised, we have vowed, we will never publish a black book. You'll never see an occult book from us which is black. The world does not need black occult literature, right? No, it needs black occult literature, but not the color black. You know, black with silver lettering. You know, we don't do that. I don't know what color Giordano Bruno will be. It might be kind of teal or something. I don't know, something optimistic. You know, this is the work of Alice Winkler, who's one of the proprietors of Black Letter Press, but she's also the artistic director and a designer. And her design work on these, and particularly obviously the bindings, which are produced in Venice, with very, very good printer. But the illustrations, she reworks everything, and so you know they're crisp, they're very clear and beautifully produced, and so that's her work. You know, as you can see here, it's just first class. You know. And so, yeah, and again, you should get Alice on, talk to Alice about the process of, you know, working on these things, because it's fascinating. That they are kind of, you know, pocket-sized, because that's usually not the case. It's kind of traditional for them to be enormous quartos, you know. But I like the idea of them being kind of, you know, and I believe at some point, we're talking with Giordano Bruno, we are talking about having a paperback edition, and I hope eventually Agrippa will also have his paperback edition as well, because I'd like it to be more accessible. And, you know, it's getting that balance right. You know, I think the scholar tools have that balance between, you know, their paperbacks and their hardbacks, and I think we're thinking in very similar terms. But I like the idea that it's something you can carry around and whip out. You know, you're down a cafe and you can pull this out and look very, very, very attractive. I mean, really, that book makes you look good. You know, you can feel the desire dripping off you, you know, like honey. Yeah, you know, imagine having 4 of them, all 4 of them.